Detroit, Michigan. Winter, 1942, the air inside the Detroit Arsenal tank plant vibrated with thunder. Steel plates crashed against the floor. Sparks rained from welding torches. The echo of rivet guns struck the walls like machine gun fire. Everywhere, men and women moved with mechanical precision. Factory workers, not soldiers, yet building the weapons that would decide the fate of continents. At the center of the noise, a foreman's voice roared above the engines. "Next one ready?" A hulking mass of armor. 40 tons of riveted steel rolled slowly down the line, its treads clanking across the concrete. It wasn't art, it wasn't elegant, but it worked. In the span of an hour, another tank would follow, and another, and another. Just a few years earlier, experts said this was impossible, that tanks couldn't be mass-produced like cars. The machinery was too complex, the tolerances too tight, the logistics too demanding. But one engineer's blueprint, drawn on a drafting table in Detroit, had proved them all wrong. This was the new battlefield, not of mud and blood, but of blueprints, engines, and endurance. The arsenal of democracy had come to life. By 1940, war was no longer fought by armies, it was fought by industries. Every victory began in a factory. Every defeat was born from a shortage of machines. In Europe, the transformation was already complete. German tanks, the Panzer III and Panzer IV, rolled through Poland and France with terrifying precision. Their movements were coordinated, fast, and disciplined. The world watched in shock as the myth of trench warfare died beneath the treads of blitzkrieg. The lesson was brutal and clear. Whoever could build faster would win. But across the Atlantic, the United States was still asleep. Its army ranked 19th in size, smaller than Portugal's. Its tank force consisted of barely a few hundred outdated models. In 1940, the U.S. Army's standard tank was the M2, an under-armored, under-gunned relic with rivets that popped off under impact. The country had the talent. It had the resources, but it lacked the system. Factories built cars, not tanks. Production lines made Fords, Chryslers, and Buicks, not armor plating or diesel engines. The idea of turning Detroit's peacetime auto plants into engines of war seemed as far-fetched as flying to the moon. Then, the war came closer. When France fell in June 1940, the illusion of distance vanished. German armor had defeated one of the world's most respected militaries in just 6 weeks. Washington realized that if the United States ever entered the war, it would face an enemy already years ahead in design, doctrine, and experience. President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave his now famous call to arms. We must become the great arsenal of democracy. It was more than a slogan. It was an ultimatum. If the United States couldn't outproduce Germany, it wouldn't survive long enough to outfight it. But there was a problem. America had never mass-produced weapons of war. Every tank, gun, and aircraft had been built by hand, in small batches, by craftsmen who treated each machine like a custom order. That system had to die, and something entirely new had to replace it. In 1940, U.S. Army ordnance officers approached industrial leaders with a demand that sounded absurd: produce 1,000 tanks per month. The auto executives laughed, not out of disrespect, but disbelief. Tanks weren't cars. They required armor plating, custom engines, complex transmissions. No single company could build all the parts, let alone assemble them at that speed. Still, one man didn't laugh. William S. Knudsen, a former executive at General Motors, had been appointed by Roosevelt to oversee national defense production. He understood something the generals didn't, that mass production wasn't just about building, it was about organization. Knudsen believed that if engineers could design tanks like automobiles with standardized parts and a modular structure, then assembly line, warfare could become real. He reached out to another automotive giant, Chrysler Corporation. And there, inside the drafting offices of Detroit, an engineer named K.T. Keller began sketching what many called the impossible blueprint. It was a design not for a tank, but for a system. Keller's proposal turned traditional manufacturing on its head. Instead of building tanks in small batches, his design broke the process into hundreds of repeatable steps. Each worker would handle one operation: a weld, a rivet, a fitting. Each component would be standardized, interchangeable, identical. It was the same logic that had once made Henry Ford's Model T a revolution. But now, it would be applied to machines of war. The U.S. Army was skeptical. So were many in Washington. But Knudsen believed in Keller's vision. He fought to fund it. And won. In the summer of 1940, the Army broke ground on a vast field outside Detroit. The press called it the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant. It would become the beating heart of America's mechanized might, and the first factory in history built exclusively to mass-produce tanks. Still, few believed it would work. Germany's factories relied on precision craftsmanship, not speed. The Allies doubted that industrial scale could match German quality, but Keller's team was determined to prove otherwise. They didn't just want to build tanks. They wanted to build a river of them. Within 2 years, that river would become a flood, one that no German division could ever dam. Because the battle for the future of warfare wasn't being fought in deserts or cities, it was being fought here, in Detroit, beneath the glow of welding sparks and the echo of hammers. The site outside Detroit was little more than mud and farmland when construction began in September 1940. Within weeks, cranes and bulldozers covered the horizon. Steel beams rose from the earth like ribs of a giant machine being born. When it opened in 1941, the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant became the largest tank factory in the world. Designed by architect Albert Kahn, it stretched over 1 million square feet, a city of concrete and steel built for one purpose: to arm democracy. Inside, Chrysler's engineers installed something no military planner had ever seen before: a fully mechanized tank assembly line. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't polished, but it worked. Sections of tanks were welded on moving cranes, bolted to chassis on the line, tested at the far end of the hall, and then rolled directly onto trains bound for the front. Each piece, gearboxes, tracks, turrets, engines, was built in parallel by different suppliers across the Midwest, then synchronized to arrive just in time for assembly. The complexity was staggering. But Chrysler had done this before. Not with tanks, but with cars. That experience became America's greatest weapon. In early 1941, hundreds of automobile engineers, foremen, and factory workers were pulled from Chrysler, Dodge, and Plymouth plants and reassigned to the arsenal. Many had never seen a tank before. They learned on the job, welding armor, casting turrets, adjusting transmissions that weighed as much as small cars. Women joined the workforce in record numbers, taking over machinery once reserved for men at the front. Their overalls bore patches not of car brands, but of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. Inside those walls, civilian industry and military purpose fused into one unstoppable rhythm. Each department developed its own specialization. One team focused solely on track assembly. Another handled the welding of hulls. A third perfected the mounting of the 75mm gun, a delicate process once considered impossible to mass produce. Day and night, the factory thundered. The floor vibrated with the constant motion of engines and men. Detroit had become something new, the industrial front line of the war. But the transformation didn't happen smoothly. Early production was plagued by delays, shortages, and constant redesigns. The Army wanted more armor. The engineers demanded simpler construction. William Knudsen, overseeing the entire defense program, acted as mediator. His message to both sides was simple: perfection is the enemy of production. Every problem was met with innovation. When Germany's tanks outgunned the first American models, Chrysler reworked the blueprints overnight, adding sloped armor, stronger engines, and new cast turrets without ever halting the line. It was this ability to adapt while producing that defined American industry's genius. Factories didn't stop to perfect. They perfected through production. By mid-1942, the arsenal was producing one M3 Lee or M4 Sherman every 50 minutes. A machine that once took months to hand-build could now be born, tested, and shipped in a single day. To military observers, it looked like madness. To Chrysler's engineers, it was music. When President Roosevelt toured the plant, he called it a marvel of modern war. To him, these roaring machines symbolized something greater than technology. They symbolized America's awakening. Every tank that left Detroit carried the hands of thousands. Machinists, welders, mothers, engineers, foremen, each playing a part in something vast and impersonal, yet deeply human. It was industrial art. Brutal, precise, and alive. By 1943, Detroit had become the beating heart of global production. Over 22,000 tanks rolled off the arsenal's lines, shipped to Africa, Italy, and later France. Many arrived faster than the Army could ship them. Factories across the nation followed Detroit's lead. Ford built bombers. General Motors built engines. Packard built aircraft for Britain. The United States had done what no nation had ever done before. It had turned its consumer economy into a war machine. From the snow and steel of Michigan came something that no army in the world could match, a force that could outproduce destruction itself. And at the center of it all, a single blueprint, drawn by a man who refused to believe that impossible was real. The machinery was running, but now came the true test. Could these mass-produced tanks survive the battlefield? Because ahead lay Africa, Normandy, and the brutal plains of Europe, where production lines would meet the fire of German precision. Detroit in 1942 didn't sleep. Its skyline flickered with orange light, welding arcs, furnace fires, and the constant hum of steel in motion. The people who filled the arsenal's halls weren't soldiers, but they fought their own kind of war. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Their hands blistered, their lungs blackened, their backs ached, and yet every tank that rolled off the line felt like a victory. Men too old to fight took jobs cutting armor plates. Women who had never held a wrench now worked on gun mounts and transmissions. Teenagers drove forklifts across factory floors bigger than football fields. For them, the enemy was inefficiency. Every delay meant another soldier overseas without protection. They called it victory work. The pride was real. For every tank shipped out, someone would chalk their initials on the inside of the hull. A silent message to the men who would one day ride it into battle. We built this for you. Bring it home. The arsenal's heartbeat wasn't mechanical. It was human. 1,000,000 small acts of effort fused into one unstoppable rhythm. For decades, engineers were trained to think in terms of precision. Each machine hand-fitted, each piece machined for perfection. But war demanded something else entirely: repetition. The blueprint drawn by Chrysler's team broke that tradition. Every component, engine block, gear, hull plate, had to fit perfectly, no matter where or when it was made. Factories hundreds of miles apart could produce identical parts that clicked together without adjustment. That idea, interchangeability, was revolutionary in heavy armor design. It allowed engineers to treat tanks not as individual masterpieces, but as systems. If one broke down, Its parts could be replaced by another pulled straight off the line. This modular approach transformed logistics. The U.S. Army could repair tanks in the field with parts shipped from any plant in the country, something no German unit could match. Germany's tanks were marvels of engineering. Precise, intricate, over-designed. But their complexity was their weakness. While one Tiger or Panther took weeks to build, Detroit could build a dozen Shermans. In the end, simplicity became superiority. When the first Shermans reached the battlefield in 1942, they didn't impress the Germans. They were slower, less armored, and less deadly on paper. But they came in numbers no one had ever imagined possible. In North Africa, British and American crews soon realized what Detroit's engineers had truly given them: endurance. If a tank broke down, there was another ready to replace it. If one was destroyed, two more arrived by convoy within weeks. By 1943, Allied commanders began planning offensives around production schedules. Entire operations, like Operation Torch and later Overlord, were timed according to how many tanks Detroit could deliver. The factory had become a weapon in itself. Even German intelligence officers noticed. Captured documents revealed that by mid-1943, the Wehrmacht had begun calling the U.S. industrial machine Die Fabrikfront, the factory front. They feared it as much as any battlefield. The results spoke for themselves. By 1944, the Allies fielded more armored divisions than Germany could even fuel. The Shermans weren't perfect. They burned easily, and German gunners nicknamed them Tommy Cookers. But their strength wasn't in any single tank. It was in the system that made them replaceable. In war, that meant invincibility by another name. Detroit's engineers had redefined what it meant to fight. They'd turned production into strategy, assembly into artillery, and labor into lethal precision. From that point forward, war would never again be won by skill alone. It would be won by systems, by supply, by scale. As the factory floor roared, another front opened, not with machines, but with minds. Because the next challenge wasn't to build faster. It was to coordinate the flood of metal into an organized weapon across oceans and continents. And that would demand leadership, visionaries who could see the entire war not as chaos, but as an equation. Leadership during the Second World War wasn't confined to generals and admirals. Some of the most decisive orders of the war were issued not from battlefields, but from boardrooms. In Washington, William S. Knudsen faced a challenge unlike any commander before him. His battlefield was a blueprint. His soldiers were engineers. His victories were measured not in captured ground, but in output. Knudsen, a former executive from General Motors, understood what the Army still struggled to grasp. Production was logistics. Logistics was power. He surrounded himself with industrial minds like K.T. Keller from Chrysler and Edsel Ford, heir to the Ford empire. Their collaboration transcended rivalry. These were men trained to compete in business, now united by necessity. When shortages threatened production, Knudsen overhauled supply chains. When bureaucrats stalled decisions, he cut through them with one sentence: "You can't win a war with forms. You win it with factories." Roosevelt trusted him completely. Knudsen's coordination of industry became so critical that military leaders began referring to him unofficially as General Production. At the Detroit Arsenal, Keller's command was no less decisive. He reorganized Chrysler's entire corporate structure around wartime needs. Executives became line supervisors. Designers became mechanics. No rank mattered, only results. It was total mobilization, not just of machines, but of minds. And through it, Keller achieved what few had believed possible: turning civilian capitalism into military precision. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a metaphor. It was real, humming, glowing, unstoppable. As American tanks began appearing in Africa and Italy, German intelligence officers were baffled. At first, they dismissed the Shermans as crude, inferior machines, lacking the elegance of their own Panther or Tiger tanks. But the reports from the front grew, impossible to ignore. A single German tank might destroy 2 or 3 Shermans, but then 6 more would appear. Artillery shells might burn through one column, but another would replace it before the smoke cleared. German engineers, accustomed to precision craftsmanship, couldn't comprehend the scale. The American war machine seemed endless. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, recognized the danger. In one dispatch from North Africa, he warned Berlin, "The enemy's strength is not his tank. It is his production." It was a bitter truth. Germany's factories, bombed night after night, were struggling to keep up. Each Panther that left the line was a masterpiece, but one that took thousands of hours, hundreds of hands, and rare materials that Germany could no longer afford. Meanwhile, America's factories were flooding the world with steel. By 1944, the U.S. was producing twice as many tanks as Germany and its allies combined. For every Tiger lost, 10 Shermans rolled ashore in Normandy. For every Panther destroyed, a trainload of replacement parts. Arrived from Detroit, German officers began calling the Sherman the ghost tank. Not because it was invisible, but because it never seemed to stop coming. The war of craftsmanship had met the war of capacity, and capacity was winning. The industrial miracle of America wasn't built on profit. It was built on purpose. By 1942, the nation had become a single coordinated machine. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Railways, shipyards, and foundries pulsed in rhythm with the arsenal of democracy. But beneath the noise was something quieter, a shift in moral identity. For decades, America's strength had been measured in consumption, in comfort, in the freedom to buy and build. Now, that same spirit had been transformed into sacrifice. Workers didn't see themselves as employees anymore. They saw themselves as part of a national mission. Children collected scrap metal. Housewives melted down pots and pans. Farmers repaired tractors with salvaged tank parts. The same economy that had once symbolized individualism now symbolized unity. And at the heart of it all stood the blue-collar worker, the welder, the machinist, the riveter, the anonymous citizen who built the weapons that would liberate the world. For many, that realization was profound. They weren't just building machines, they were defending ideals. The factory floor became sacred ground. Every spark from a welding torch felt like a small act of defiance against tyranny. Every finished tank that rolled off the line carried within it not only steel and bolts, but conviction. The moral of Detroit was simple. Freedom wasn't free, but it could be manufactured. By 1943, the rhythm of the arsenal echoed from coast to coast. The hum of machinery became the soundtrack of a nation at war, and as Allied tanks rolled across deserts and fields, the commanders who fought inside them carried more than armor. They carried the weight of millions who believed that ingenuity itself could win a war. But soon, theory would meet reality, because the battlefield was waiting, and the true test of this industrial miracle would come under fire. In Africa, in Europe, and in the desperate winter of 1944, November 1942, the sun over North Africa shimmered against the sand, turning the battlefield into a mirage of heat and dust. Across that golden wasteland, the engines of the first M4 Sherman tanks roared to life. They were the product of America's factories, still new, still untested in real war. Each one bore the smell of oil, paint, and steel, shipped straight from Detroit to the front. When the invasion of Operation Torch began, hundreds of Shermans rolled ashore in Algeria and Morocco, their treads sinking into foreign sand for the first time. Awaiting them were the veterans of the Africa Corps, Rommel's seasoned tank crews, armed with the formidable Panzer-Wehrfus. The Germans were confident. Their tanks had dominated every front since 1939. They didn't expect the Americans to bring anything different. But the moment the Shermans appeared, everything changed. The Shermans weren't perfect, but they were plentiful. Where the Germans fielded dozens, the Allies landed hundreds. In their first clash at Kasserine Pass, the Shermans fought unevenly. Many crews inexperienced, some tanks outgunned. Yet their endurance stunned even their commanders. They could absorb damage, retreat, repair, and return. And more importantly, there were always more coming. Rommel's staff officers began to notice something unusual. After each battle, Allied losses were replenished within days. German armor, meanwhile, grew scarcer with every engagement. Rommel wrote privately in his war diary, "The Americans fight with factories, not tactics." He was right. For the first time in modern history, production itself was dictating battlefield tempo. The U.S. Army could sustain prolonged fighting without pause, a rhythm powered not by fuel or courage alone, but by Detroit's relentless assembly lines. German tank commanders soon learned that destroying a Sherman wasn't victory. It was a delay. Each one destroyed was merely replaced by another, newer, often improved version. It was warfare at industrial scale. The Allies called it saturation strength, a constant flood of material that overwhelmed even the most elite enemy formations. By 1943, the Shermans that survived North Africa had been upgraded and modified. They crossed the Mediterranean into Sicily and then into Italy, advancing with a momentum that no single division could slow. Each Sherman carried the mark of Detroit, serial numbers stamped into its steel, components interchangeable with any other tank. For the men who drove them, they weren't just machines. They were lifelines. Crews gave them names: Faithful, Rebel, Old Betsy. They painted wives' names on turrets, symbols on hatches, and lucky charms on barrels. Inside the armored hulls, Detroit's metal became something more, a vessel of survival. As one U.S. tank commander later said, "You didn't love the Sherman, but you trusted her. She'd always get you home." That trust mattered more than armor thickness or gun caliber. June 1944. D-Day. As Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Shermans followed, ferried across the channel on landing craft, engines roaring through surf and chaos. On the cliffs above, German artillery opened fire. Many tanks never made it off the beach, but those that did began climbing through mud and smoke, forming the armored spearhead of the invasion. Behind them lay months of preparation, each tank a product of thousands of workers, from welders in Detroit to machinists in Toledo. For the Germans defending Normandy, it was the first glimpse of the scale of America's power. They'd fought Soviet swarms in the east, but never industrial precision like this. When the beaches were finally secured, over 1,000 Shermans were operational in France within days. They rolled inland like a steel tide, each one a fragment of the vast machine that had started in a single engineer's sketch. Then came the test that would define them. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the Shermans encountered their nemesis, the Tiger and the Panther tanks. German armor was devastating. Its guns could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. Allied crews called their tanks Rosies, a grim nickname after the lighter brand. Lights every time. But while Tigers and Panthers terrified in single combat, they couldn't stop the avalanche. A Tiger might destroy 5 Shermans before it ran out of ammunition or fuel. But for every Tiger, there were 50 Shermans. Tanks could be replaced. Men could be trained. Logistics could replenish. The Germans couldn't. As the Allies advanced through France, the Wehrmacht's armored divisions shrank daily. Factories bombed, fuel gone, crews exhausted, and still Detroit kept sending more. In the summer of 1944, an Allied staff officer wrote home, "Our tanks aren't perfect, but they never stop coming. That's why we'll win." He was right. The concept once dismissed as impossible, mass production of tanks, had become the decisive force of the war. The battle of technology had been replaced by the battle of numbers, but the struggle wasn't over. Ahead lay the hardest winter of the war, the Battle of the Bulge, where America's industrial strength would face its final, most desperate challenge. December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried under snow. Quiet, frozen, peaceful. And then the silence shattered. From the mist came the roar of engines, hundreds of German tanks surging westward in one last desperate gamble. It was Hitler's final offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads smashed into the thin American lines, cutting through supply roads, overrunning villages, and pushing Allied forces into retreat. Among the attackers were Germany's best, Panthers, Tigers, and newly improved King Tigers, monstrous machines with guns that could destroy a Sherman before it ever saw them. For a moment, the Allies reeled. The front bent under the pressure. Snow turned black with oil and smoke. But this time, the Americans had something they hadn't in 1940 or 1942. They had depth, an industrial ocean behind every frontline river. While German tank battalions strained their final reserves, the American response was measured, precise, mechanical. In Detroit, the lines didn't stop. Even as blizzards buried Europe, workers in Michigan pulled night shifts under humming lamps, producing tank after tank for the front. Trains rattled east with shipments of engines, treads, and ammunition, an unbroken artery of supply. The U.S. Army could lose tanks in battle and replace them within days. The Germans, by contrast, couldn't replace a single Tiger without dismantling another. At one point, as the Ardennes fighting reached its peak, Allied High Command ordered a massive surge of reinforcements. Within 2 weeks, over 1,500 replacement Shermans were shipped across the Atlantic. It was an achievement as stunning as any battlefield victory. The arsenal of democracy had become a living organism, breathing steel, moving mountains, and feeding an army that refused to run dry. The Battle of the Bulge raged for 6 weeks. The weather froze everything. Fuel lines, tracks, morale. Yet even under those conditions, the Shermans kept moving. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks, used spare parts shipped from half a world away, and turned burned-out machines into mobile fortresses again. The Tigers, heavy and over-engineered, often froze in the snow. Fuel shortages left them stranded in forests, their massive engines powerless in the cold. By January 1945, the German offensive had stalled completely. When the skies finally cleared, Allied aircraft swarmed overhead, guided by the same factories that produced the tanks, the same blueprints, the same systems of mass supply. Within days, the tide reversed. Thousands of Shermans, many with fresh paint still shining beneath frost, surged eastward again, pushing the once feared Wehrmacht back toward the Rhine. Germany had gambled everything on one final strike, and it had broken against the wall of American production. The winter of 1944 proved something that went beyond tactics or firepower. It proved that industrial endurance could break military genius. Germany's engineers built masterpieces. America built momentum. Every German tank that burned out was irreplaceable. Every American tank destroyed was simply another entry on a production sheet. Scheduled, tracked, rebuilt. One German officer later wrote in a captured letter, "We kill their tanks, and more appear. We destroy their convoys, and the road fills again. It is not a war of men anymore. It is a war of machines, and they have learned how to make war without pause. By March 1945, the German armored divisions were gone. Their legendary machines, the tigers and panthers that had once ruled Europe, lay silent, outnumbered, outproduced, and outlasted. The Shermans, still imperfect, still vulnerable, rolled across the Rhine like a tide of iron. They had won not because they were invincible, but because they were inescapable. Back in Detroit, the man who had designed the original assembly line blueprint, K.T. Keller, received a telegram from the War Department. It read simply, "Production victory achieved." He never saw combat. He never fired a shot. But his signature had been stamped, literally, onto history, on the hulls of more than 50,000 Shermans. When the final tank rolled out of the Arsenal plant in 1945, Keller walked the factory floor one last time. The lights were dimming. The war was ending. Yet, the echoes of what he had built, the rhythm of machines, the courage of workers, the pulse of a nation, lingered in the air. Detroit had done what generals alone could not. It had turned vision into velocity. The blueprint that everyone once called impossible had outlasted empires. The arsenal of democracy had proven that wars are not just won by those who fight the hardest, but by those who build the fastest, learn the quickest, and never stop moving forward. And as the tanks rolled through the ruins of Germany in the spring of 1945, they carried with them a truth that every future war would remember. The hand that holds the wrench can be mightier than the one that holds the gun. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The tanks that once thundered through France and Germany now sat idle. Engines cold, treads caked with dust, their crews waiting for the journey home. Across the Atlantic, the factories that had fed those armies began to fall silent. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant, once the loudest heartbeat of the industrial war, slowed to a whisper. Where sparks once danced, now there was quiet. But the silence carried meaning. Because it wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence of completion. For 5 years, these assembly lines had worked without pause. Now, the men and women who built the world's mightiest machines were finally free to rest, and to see what their work had truly accomplished. For millions of factory workers, the end of the war brought pride and uncertainty. Their mission was complete, but their purpose had changed overnight. Men who had spent years riveting armor now returned to making fenders and dashboards. Women, the Rosies, who had welded and lifted and led entire shifts, were told to go home, make way for the returning soldiers. Yet the war had changed them. They had proven something to the world, and to themselves, that skill, precision, and discipline didn't belong to rank or gender. One former worker later recalled, "We weren't soldiers, but we fought the war in our own way. Every tank that left Detroit was a bullet aimed at tyranny." The pride never left them. Even decades later, many kept fragments of their work. A photo, a rivet, a worn factory badge. Reminders that, once, they were part of the engine that saved the world. The United States emerged from the war as an industrial superpower. Its factories, once built for tanks, planes, and ships, now turned their power toward peace. The same production lines that had built Shermans began building cars, trucks, tractors, and home appliances. America's highways filled with the same engines that had once rumbled across Europe. The arsenal of democracy had become the workshop of prosperity. William Knudsen returned to private life. K.T. Keller guided Chrysler into the post-war boom, using wartime methods to design new generations of automobiles. The same precision that had once crafted armor plating now shaped chrome and steel for a new world. But the legacy of war never truly left their minds. Because in proving they could build faster than anyone else, they had also proven something more dangerous, that production itself had become a form of power. Historians later called it the birth of the military-industrial complex. The government had seen what coordinated industry could do, how quickly civilian factories could be turned into weapons. And they would never forget it. The lessons of the arsenal became the blueprint for a new kind of readiness, a permanent state of industrial alert. Even as peace returned, contracts flowed. The same engineers who had designed Shermans began developing jet fighters. The same plants that had once rolled out tanks would one day produce nuclear bombers and missiles. The line between wartime production and peacetime industry blurred forever. Yet, beneath the politics and strategy, something deeply human remained. The factory workers, engineers, and foremen of Detroit didn't see themselves as architects of empire. They saw themselves as craftsmen of survival. They'd turned knowledge into strength, blueprints into weapons, and steel into freedom. And when the war was finally over, they could look at their hands, scarred, calloused, tired, and know that those hands had changed the world. The war had ended, but the hum of the machines still echoed. In memory, in invention, in every automobile that rolled off America's post-war roads. Because Detroit had proven a truth that went far beyond battle, that the capacity to build is the capacity to endure. When peace came, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant didn't close. It adapted. The war had proven that modern conflict wasn't just fought by armies, but by industries. And in that new world, blueprints became as valuable as bullets. From 1945 onward, the same engineering logic that once built tanks began to shape the future of the U.S. military. Factories that had once forged turrets now produced armored personnel carriers. Assembly lines once built for Shermans were redesigned for jet engines and missiles. The system itself, modular, scalable, efficient, had become the ultimate invention. That was the real legacy of K.T. Keller's impossible design. He hadn't just built tanks, he'd built a process, one that any nation could copy, and many did. In the years that followed, the world studied America's methods. British, French, and Soviet engineers analyzed how the U.S. had turned raw industry into strategic dominance. The Soviets, especially, understood its implications. Their post-war designs, the T-54, the MiG-15, even early nuclear missile programs, were driven by one goal: to match the American model of mass-production warfare. Factories across Eastern Europe began mirroring Detroit's system, turning out tanks and jets in numbers that could rival the West. The Cold War became not just an arms race, but a production race. The blueprint born in a Chrysler drafting room now circled the globe, copied, refined, militarized, and at its core lay the same principle that had once powered the arsenal of democracy. If you can make enough of anything, you can win anything. For the people who had lived it, the war's end didn't erase its lessons. It deepened them. K.T. Keller, when interviewed years later, spoke not of victory or power, but of faith in process. There was no magic to it, he said. You organize, you learn, you trust your people, and you never stop improving. He had no statues, no medals, no monuments. But his legacy rolled on, not just in tanks, but in the way entire industries thought about progress. William Knudsen died in 1948, having served both as an industrialist and as a general without uniform. In his obituary, the New York Times wrote, "He armed a nation faster than it knew it was at war." The words captured the essence of an invisible victory, a triumph of logistics, of foresight, of the human capacity to transform imagination into motion. By the 1950s, U.S. generals and policymakers openly referred to industrial capacity as a strategic weapon. The lessons of the Detroit arsenal became embedded in every future war plan. In Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts, the same logic applied. The ability to outproduce, outrepair, and outlast the enemy was considered just as critical as tactics or technology. For the first time in history, engineering became strategy. Every drawing board, every assembly line, every logistics route was part of the battle plan. Wars would now be fought with spreadsheets, blueprints, and supply chains as much as soldiers and shells. The world had crossed a line, and there was no going back. In the decades that followed, the arsenal of democracy faded into memory. The buildings aged, the machines quieted, but its influence never disappeared. Every time a modern army deploys, vehicles by the thousands. Every time a jet rolls off a production line identical to the one before it. Every time nations measure strength by the scale of their factories, they are following the same rhythm that began with one engineer's impossible idea. K.T. Keller and his team didn't just build tanks. They built the modern world's understanding of power, not as a single machine, but as a system. Their lesson endures, that victory belongs not only to those who fight, but to those who build faster, smarter, and together. The arsenal of democracy had ended the greatest war in history, but it also began something larger. An age where the assembly line would decide the fate of nations, and at its core, hidden beneath layers of steel, statistics, and smoke, remained one undeniable truth. It all began with a single blueprint that no one believed could work. It began with a pencil, a single blueprint drawn on paper, fragile, uncertain, dismissed as impossible. And from that line of graphite came the roar of thousands of engines, the march of a nation, the birth of a new kind of power. Inside the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, sparks once fell like stars. Men and women worked without rest, each movement measured, each weld deliberate. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as necessary. When the war ended, the noise stopped. The machines cooled. The echoes faded. But what they built never truly left. The blueprint had become more than a design. It had become a philosophy. That strength could come from organization. That precision could be multiplied. That an idea, when shared by thousands of hands, could shape history. The men who drew those lines and the workers who followed them didn't fight in trenches or skies, but their fingerprints are on every victory that followed. Normandy, Bastogne, Berlin. Their legacy is not the machines themselves, but the proof that human ingenuity can outthink fear, outbuild destruction, and outlast tyranny. The arsenal of democracy was more than a place. It was a statement that in the darkest hours of history, creation itself can become resistance. And so, long after the last tank rolled out, long after the last foreman turned off the lights, the spirit of that factory remained. In every humming motor, every gleaming assembly line, every dream that begins with someone saying, "It can't be done." Because the truth, whispered in the steel bones of Detroit, will always be this: nothing built with purpose is ever truly finished.